Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Chinese President Xi Jinping says that as a responsible nation, Beijing can't be a bystander to the Ukraine conflict, and China always stands on the side of peace, and China's core position regarding Ukraine conflict is to promote peace via talks. Now, this is what Chinese President Xi Jinping has said during a phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, which was an hour-long call. And this particular call has been termed as meaningful by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Earlier, we saw that China released a 12-point peace proposal regarding the resolution of the Ukraine conflict, which was welcomed by both Russia and Ukraine, that urged for an immediate ceasefire and the resumption of the peace talks between the two conflicting sides. However, the West, the US and its NATO allies didn't accept that particular peace proposal, rather questioned the position of China regarding being a peace mediator or peace broker in this particular conflict. Now, specifically talking about this phone call between Ukrainian president and Chinese president, Russia has welcomed Chinese initiative for a negotiated political settlement. The US has also welcomed this particular phone call, yet it has said that it is too soon to tell whether it will lead to a peace deal. Now, on the other hand, we have seen NATO's chief, Jens Stoltenberg, has said that the US-led alliance has provided over 98% of the combat vehicles to Ukraine. At the same time, in another major development, we've seen Britain's Armed Forces Minister told the Parliament that the government has already started the shipment of depleted uranium ammunition to Ukraine. When the UK decided to provide Ukraine with the depleted uranium ammunition, it was strongly condemned by Russian President Vladimir Putin, who said Russia was would be forced to act accordingly. Russian Defense Minister at that time had said that the British decision left fewer steps before a potential nuclear collision between Russia and the West. After that, Russia also decided to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in the neighboring Belarus. In today's show, we will be talking about how likely is the chance of a success of China's mediation regarding the resolution of the Ukraine conflict, given the fact that recently we have seen a success on the foreign policy front for China regarding the Iran-Saudi rapprochement, and amid the continuity of the supply of weapons from NATO and the Western nations to Ukraine, what are the chances? Is there any potential threat of a nuclear war between the West and Russia? To understand entire gamut of this particular situation, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Air Marshal retired Mr. FARHAT Hussain Khan. He is President, Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Mr. FARHAT, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News. We really appreciate that. On Skype at the same time from Wiesbaden, Germany, we are being joined by Ms. HELGA ZEPP LAROUCHE. She is founder and chairwoman, SHILLER Institute. Ms. LAROUCHE, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Let me begin with the first question towards you, Ms. LAROUCHE. Now, how important and significant was this call between Ukrainian and Chinese president? And also Beijing saying that it wants to send an envoy to Kyiv to mediate a political settlement. How do you see that also?
Well, I think this is extremely important and urgent, given the fact that the world is really on the verge of a nuclear catastrophe. I think that if there's any country which has the power and credibility to mediate this conflict, it is China. First of all, I think China has proven in the past absolutely that it is impartial. It was able to, as you just mentioned, to, get the governments of Iran and Saudi Arabia to the negotiation table. And now, the president of Iran has been welcomed by Saudi Arabia in a brotherly way. I mean, that's a big jump forward. And so I would really say that while the situation is extremely complex in Ukraine and around Ukraine, that there is a glimpse of hope, definitely. I think that what will come out of it, I think, I personally think that President Zelensky is happy that President Xi Jinping has reached out to Ukraine in the way he did, because the Ukrainian people are the worst victims of this proxy war between the West and Russia, and they're being slaughtered. And especially after the recent Pentagon leaks, where basically it came out that the United States government judged the military situation much worse than they were saying publicly. I mean, that, in my view, makes the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military the victims in the pawn in a larger chess game. And the sooner that ends, the better. So I think this is extremely important. If it will succeed, I think everybody has to be extremely watchful, because I think the United States is very factionalized. There are some people who I would say are realists, like General Milley, who already several months ago demanded that there should be negotiations right now, and that is the military. So there are some people who I think will be also backing this proposal, but there are also some hawks. For example, this week alone, there is a whole meeting of the post-Russia forum from the Hudson Institute and others in Washington, even in Capitol Hill, who are talking about splitting Russia into 10 or 12 different pieces. And, certain other people have talked about that the whole aim is to weaken Russia, to ruin Russia. And from the British side came, not only the depleted uranium weapons, which I think is really a total escalation, but also they have been pushing the Ukrainians to retake Crimea and have what they call a Cuban Missile Crisis on steroids. So, this is a very complex situation, but I think if any country can do something, it is China.
Right. Let me bring in Mr. FARHAT into the discussion. Also, Mr. FARHAT, how do you see this particular phone call between Ukrainian president and the Chinese president? Earlier, we saw when China released the 12-point peace proposal for the resolution of the Ukraine conflict. It was welcomed by the Ukrainian president that time. Now he has termed this particular phone call with Mr. Xi Jinping as being meaningful. Your take regarding that?
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Actually, to state right at the onset, this telephone call is very significant, even if it has made a small ice-breaking. Reason being, the Ukraine war has taken a lot of toll in many fronts: political, strategic, military terms, and more so on the economic front of the entire world. And if you allow me to call it, it was a mini world war. It has affected everybody. So any dent into pushing this crisis backwards is a success. That's one. So therefore needs to be encouraged. It has been acknowledged by the Soviet Union, Russia, as well as United States. That's one. Secondly, whenever such things happen, it is the credibility of the arbitrator that matters. Now look at China. I will talk of Iran, Saudi Arabia later on, but go back by 20, 30 years. In the entire process of the world politics and the world order that we've been talking about it, China has never been aggressive to any country. One, they have always talked of peace. When the US-led coalition raised the hype of Indo-Pacific strategy to contain China, there also they presented a 5-point peace formula. So Mr. Xi has been here and has demonstrated his abilities to conduct peace. That's the reliability behind the entire force. That is one. The other thing is, it has a relationship with Russia where it can make the difference, right? Second, therefore, what is the cause of the war? Cause of the war is the Russian concern of security, that Ukraine should not form part of NATO, and बाकी चीज़ें, there are other things also, but prime demand उनकी ये है कि they should not join NATO, so that we have a buffer between them. So the players that are there, Russia and Ukraine, have somebody to look at in the form of President Xi as a peace mediator. I think while the results will come later, this call, which lasted for a long time, about an hour or so, and it's welcomed by the players, has already made the impact in the world environment. Look, if there is someone who can make the effect, that is Mr. Xi, and he has started moving in that direction. Of course, it's a bloody war, has caused a lot of devastation. It will probably take time, but the movement forward, presentation of the 12 points, at the first point that says, okay, at least de-escalate, and then stop the war, and then start to talk. What to talk is something later, but I think these small little steps, that the environment matters, the environment that the world has received today after this call is a message of peace from China, a country that has recently put two warriors at peace in terms of Saudi Arabia, and they were fighting for the last 35 years on various fronts. So I think China has proved its credentials, and it will make a lot of difference in peace.
Right, Mr. LaRouche, when we talk about Ukraine's perspective, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, at that time when China released this 12-point peace proposal for the resolution of the Ukraine conflict, he welcomed that. Now, after this particular call, he termed it as being meaningful. But we saw, on the other hand, when NATO Secretary General was in Ukraine, Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky asked for more weapons to continue with the war. What do we understand out of it? On one side, he wants this particular stride or the strive or the efforts which are being made by China. He welcomes those. On the other side, he calls the NATO for supplying more weapons. What do we understand out of this particular thing?
Well, I think that, you know, I have not looked into the head of Mr. Zelensky, but he already was once ready to have peace negotiations, and that was in March of 2022. This was basically in Turkey, where the chances that it could have come to a negotiated end of this war were there. And then it was Boris Johnson who personally flew into Kiev and put pressure on the Ukrainian government to not do that. So, you know, given the fact that, you know, the Ukrainian economy is completely smashed, I mean, a lot of the infrastructure is you know, destroyed. The economy is, I don't know on how many percent they're still functioning, but it's devastated. And before the war, China was the largest trade partner of Ukraine. And if Ukraine has any hope to go back to a normal life and have the reconstruction, you know, I think there are some people in the West who are already speculating on, you know, investment and basically integrating Ukraine into the West. But the West is not so attractive right now, because you look at the banking crisis in the United States, only 6 weeks after the first new Silicon Valley bank went bankrupt. Now you have a new banking crisis erupting. The UBS took over the Credit Suisse, but that is not going smoothly. So the West has severe economic problems. And frankly, you know, what is the long-term or maybe medium-term perspective, that would be that the Belt and Road Initiative would be extended as a Eurasian perspective. In that case, Ukraine would be in a completely different position and could become a bridge between Europe and, you know, the rest of Asia. Asia. So I think, if people in Ukraine think about it right, it is in their best interest that China should play a mediating role. And therefore, I think that, I personally think that President Zelensky is being pressured by the hawks in the West to go into the confrontation and, have the military victory on the battlefield. Now, I think that many military experts are basically saying that the chances for Ukraine to win on the battlefield, in quote, are practically non-existing because,
So why are they less or non-existent for that matter, Ms. LaRouche? I seek your pardon for the interruption. Why are they less? The chances of Ukrainian victory in the battle?
Well, it's the estimate, and I think this is the view of several military experts from Germany, Italy, Switzerland, France, and the Pentagon Papers said that themselves, because the Ukrainian population is much smaller than the Russian population. The idea that you can pump this country full of weapons, naturally you can escalate, and then you reach a tripwire, and then you are risking a large war, but then nobody wins either. So I don't think that the idea of winning this war in Ukraine I think even in the United States, several people have dropped that recently, among others, Mr. Haas, who is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. So the voices who basically say, look, let's stop this. This was a terrible thing. It should never have happened. Is that the number of people is growing. So I think that naturally you could fight this war for forever and have a grinding up of the population. But, I think that that is not a realistic perspective. I mean, if people push the Ukrainians, for example, to use weapons which hit long into the territory of Russia, then you are in danger of crossing a red line. And Mr. Medvedev has warned, and not only Medvedev, several Russian officials in the recent weeks have warned dramatically that we are inching step by step towards the great catastrophe. And also, if people are urging the Ukrainians to retake Crimea, then that is another red line. So I think that this intervention, of President Xi Jinping coming into the picture is really like 1 second before 12. And I really can only hope that all the reasonable people in the world cooperate to make this work.
Right, Mr. Farhat, do you think there is a seriousness on the part of the Ukrainian side when it comes to them welcoming the initiatives which are being launched by China on one side? On the other, we see they're demanding more weapons from NATO to continue this war.
Actually, when we look at the balance of power in Russia and Ukraine, there is no comparison. That is one. Ukraine is not a small country, but when it compared with Russia, is not that big a military power. So I don't think they have the potentials to overpower Russia or even to penetrate Russia.
No matter how much weapons are pumped in, and how much.
The pumping in comes at a cost, which they will have to pay later on. So how much do they want to be pumped in, one? And what is the nature of that, what is being pumped in? They are being fed with mostly defensive weapons. They haven't been given a long-range bomber or long-range missiles or things like that. Yes, they've been given a lot of money. So the devastation that is caused to Ukraine so far is far more than what they are receiving in terms of lives, in terms of wars have a cost, and this war has a very serious cost for Ukraine. That's one. I think they expected that right at the beginning. When the war breaks, he made a fanatic call to the Europe for help in the first few days, because in the first 10 days Russia had fired 500 missiles at Ukraine, and that is huge. So therefore, there is no combat comparison between the two. They are only sustaining because of the political and material support from the West. And for how long will that go? That will go only till they meet the interest of the United States and the West. So, there is a difference between Chinese and the US and in this East and West. The military aid that is coming and the political aid that is coming, that is with the focus. When they think they are not achieving that, well, you know what will happen. We are the most experienced in this case, as Pakistan is most experienced in this case in withdrawal of these things. So, I think probably the president of Ukraine may have realized the road ahead is bumpy, it is nothing but destruction. How much more can he afford? Rebuilding is going to take time. Look at the countries that faced war, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, look at their condition. So, wars are do not provide answer to anything. Ukraine is stuck in between the politics of the two superpowers, yes, but unfortunately, one of them is a neighbor, which can make serious implications. So, therefore, I think
here is this position. Let's consider that Ukrainian side has understood the kind of damage and the destruction that has resulted after this particular conflict with Russia in men and material, on economic front also. It realizes and welcomes the initiatives which are being launched by China. Do you think it is in a position after this realization to strike any sort of a peace deal unilaterally without any influence from European countries or the US?
If there was an example to be quoted, once again, KSA Iran example, we all, and in fact the international community thinks, how has Saudi Arabia gone that far in this peace deal when they used to call Iran as #1 threat, along with Israel. They used to call it simultaneously.
But the situation was quite different. Yeah. Both the countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, were not in a direct conflict on the ground.
No, what I am referring to is the interests of Saudi Arabia are far better in this peace deal than in staying in a state of tension, because they have the Prince of Saudi Arabia is looking at Saudi Arabia in a different format now. No more an only oil exporting country. It is making that kind of gestures of spreading around and then finding other sources of. So, therefore, they have made. I am really impressed the way he has moved Saudi Arabia on the religious front by easing out things and then getting towards the state, away from that extremist thought that people thought, and then the economic. So, the realization of any country of their achievements, national interest, if they achieve that, I think the peace is worth it.
Right. Let me take Mr. LaRouche's view on this particular thing also. Do you think if Ukraine has finally realized that the efforts or the strides that China is trying to put in for peace and the resolution of Ukrainian conflict through talks, is it in a position to strike a peace deal without the influence of the West?
Well, that remains to be seen. You know, I don't think that the Ukrainian government is very independent. I think that there is, you know, I think it has more to do with what the factional lineup is in the West. I mean, for example, Mr. Macron has clearly indicated in the recent period that he does not want to be totally in the camp of the United States. For example, he said that in respect to Taiwan, he said Taiwan is an inner Chinese affair and the Europeans should not get drawn by the United States into this conflict, which, you know, many people, even in Germany, agree with him. Naturally, the United States and Great Britain say the opposite and basically call it a question of loyalty of the West and values of the West and all of this verbiage which is being used, you know. But the reality is, you know, I mean, any peace-loving person, anybody who is not a madman or madwoman for that matter, should understand that a continuation of the escalation threatens the annihilation of the human species. I have been studying this a lot, you know. I mean, and if you listen to people like Stephen Starr, who is a nuclear analyst in the United States, or other people who have studied what happens in the case of one nuclear weapon being used, the danger is almost 100% certainty that all nuclear weapons will be used, because I don't think that a regional nuclear war is possible. It's the logic of nuclear war that the entire arsenal comes into the play. And that means, you know, that all life on the planet will be destroyed in a nuclear winter, which follows for about 10 years after such a nuclear war. And then there will be absolutely nobody left to even study the causes, because no historian will be alive to look into the matter. And I think if people would be aware of the fact that, you know, given the fact that the warning time, you know, when one side would realize that there is a nuclear missile launched, the warning time for the leadership on one or the other side is a few minutes, somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes, where the decision has to be made. Then the flight time of ICBMs is about, I think, maximum 20 to 30 minutes, and then it's all over. That means that the warning time is so short. And if you think that how many irrational people are around, and how many almost incidents already happened where a disaster was only avoided because one pilot was able to make a very, very good flight maneuver to escape a conflict. I think if people would understand how much the human species is at risk, we all would be in the streets demanding an immediate end to the war, because, you know, people, the life of the human species and the existence of the human species is so precious. We are the most, you know, the creative species of all the other species. We are the only one who can discover things, who can make beautiful art, who can make scientific discoveries. And all of that would be lost, and for what? So I think the brinkmanship, or the very idea of geopolitics, has to be stopped. I really think that we have to move out of the idea of, unipolarity is not functioning. That has disappeared already. But also multipolarity is not good enough, because you still have the danger of geopolitical conflict between one bloc and another bloc. And I think we have to urgently move into a new paradigm where we think about the one humanity first before we think about national interest. And I think, you know, this is why I also think that President Xi Jinping is uniquely qualified, because he has in the recent period not only launched the Belt and Road Initiative, but also the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and more recently, the Global Civilizational Initiative, which is one way of putting a dialogue of cultures or dialogue of civilizations on the table. And I think a combination of all of these approaches is really necessary to diffuse the situation.
Right, Ms. LaRouche, as you have very comprehensively shed light the existential threat to humanity, the threat of use of nuclear weapons. Now, when we specifically talk about those 12 points, the point number 8 by China categorically says that reducing strategic risks, nuclear weapons must not be used and nuclear wars must not be fought. The threat or use of nuclear weapons should be opposed. On the other side, we see the UK shipping the depleted uranium shells to Ukraine, as a result of which we saw a condemnation by the Russian president. And then Russia also decided to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in neighboring Belarus. So on one side, we see the initiatives by China to discourage the use of nuclear weapons. On the other side, we continuously see the escalation on this front. How bigger a threat of use of nuclear weapons regarding Ukraine conflict at this point in time happens to be?
Well, I think Ukraine would just be the trigger point, because, you know, the United States official doctrine is, and Biden had, I think, promised at one point he would change that, but then he did not. The US has in their strategic doctrine the possibility of a preemptive use of nuclear weapons. And, you know, in the recent period, a couple of months ago, maybe less than 2 months ago, Russia has, actually President Putin has said that because of this existing US doctrine, it forces, because of the general strategic situation, it forces Russia to do likewise. That means, you know, Russia has now said that because the United States has the preemptive use of nuclear weapon in their doctrine, that Russia is basically abandoning its idea that they are not using first nuclear weapons. Now that is why I was so you know, making so much alarm on the question of how close we are, because if you have the two largest nuclear powers in the world basically, you know, not trusting each other, the trust has been completely destroyed. The usual kind of back channels do not exist. This is why I really think we are in a situation much more dangerous than even at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because if you look at the historic records, even when that crisis was at a high point, you had between Kennedy and Khrushchev a quite reasonable negotiation in the background, and I don't think that that exists right now. And that makes the situation right now much, much more dangerous. And that is why the Schiller Institute, we have been pushing the idea that we urgently need a new security and development architecture which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet. I mean, unfortunately, the idea of a European security architecture no longer looks very likely. I mean, that existed at the time of the German unification and the end of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev talked about the common European house. Putin talked many times in the beginning about a security structure from Vladivostok to Lisbon. But that, in a certain sense, the chemistry does not exist anymore because of so many things which have happened, especially the destruction of trust, to which Merkel and Hollande contributed by saying the whole Minsk agreement was just a charade to gain time to arm the Ukrainian troops. So that's why I think we have to take it a step higher, and that is the idea of having a security architecture which includes every country, Russia, China, the United States, and all the other countries. And the only way how one could do that is by having, you know, a development. I wrote 10 principles of how such a security architecture could look like. And it's a very comprehensive idea, but it connects to the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 150 years of religious war in Europe, by coming to the conclusion that if the fight would continue, there would be nobody left to enjoy the victory because everybody would be dead. And that's, I think, exactly the point where we are at, because if it comes to the use of nuclear weapons, there will be absolutely nobody who will enjoy the victory because we all will be dead. And I think that has to be the starting point. And, you know, I think we need to, I mean, we are the creative species. Can we give ourselves an order, you know, which allows the survival of the human species? You know, or are we stuck in stupid geopolitical games which, you know, risk? I think war in the time of thermonuclear weapons is not an option of conflict resolution anymore. And that's why I think the 12-point proposal by Xi Jinping is the best formula to start negotiations with. It doesn't answer all questions yet, but the whole point is to enter discussion, you know, to enter a process of sorting things out and, you know, finding out what are the vital interests of the one side, what are the absolutely non-negotiable arguments on the other side, and then to arrive at a compromise and at a higher level. You know, when you take a policy which benefits everybody, then you can find a peaceful solution. And I think we are really in an absolutely urgent need of that.
Right, Mr. FARHAT, what do you think? How can China impress upon the conflicting sides, especially when it comes to the threat of nuclear weapons?
Actually, the threat of nuclear weapons, we need to go back a little by a few months, maybe 6 months plus. When the war started, it was started by Russia. It was started by Russia to ensure that its security interests are not jeopardized. That is, we talked earlier, is Ukraine being part of NATO. So, they have been one way or the other for quite some time during the war been talking about this nuclear aspect. So, initiative has been coming, but you talked of this European response, French response also. But when we look at broad aspects, use of nuclear weapons against a neighboring country is something very, very serious. Then, when you go back to World War, Nagasaki, I think the world has learned lessons. I don't think that's a solution to any of the problems between Russia and Ukraine, because it has no, there's no getting back after a trigger is pressed, right. And then there's nothing but devastation. So, will the world let it happen, or even those who are talking about it, will they do it? So, kuch cheezein, something is there in terms of creating an environment that I will go to this extent to ensure my national interest, but will they go it? I have a serious question on that. I don't think any power would try and find a solution to Ukraine war through nuclear weapons. They haven't found a solution through tactical or operational use of these missiles and bombs and all that. They haven't found a solution to it. Yes, the United States may be enjoying some.
What about this step by the UK of shipping the shells of depleted uranium to Ukraine?
What I'm saying is, these are gestures, postures.
But of course, if they are being shipped to Ukraine, they are going to be used.
No, I don't think nuclear weapon are.
What about these depleted uranium?
Depleted uranium is not a weapon that you deplete. Let me explain.
But why was such a big reaction from the Russian side? And the Russian defense minister is saying that this particular step has left fewer steps between Russia and the West towards the nuclear collision.
Russia is conveying one thing from day one. Look, our threat on our border is very serious, and we will go to any extent to ward off that threat. This is a very clearly dictated policy of declared policy of Russia. Rest are actually, frankly, when you look at the conduct of war in the last 14 months, what has been the West doing is pumping in Ukraine into a fire, giving some money, giving some weapons. It is pumping them into fire. That's it. And I don't think, yes, this done, these are, some of the weaponry languages, you can call it, being used by West to tell Russia, look, we are here. But I personally think the world community or international community at this time is not finding solution.
Okay, so let's talk about role of China and China's neutrality. You have shed light comprehensively on this particular thing. China has never been aggressive, and it has come up with this peace proposal. Now, when that particular proposal was released by China, there was a certain welcome notes, specifically by Ukraine and France also, but widely it was rejected by the US and NATO allies. Now, this particular phone call, it is although being welcomed by the US, yet it shows a sort of skepticism regarding China's position, whether this particular phone call is going to lead into a peace deal. Why such a skepticism? Do you really think that the US doesn't want China to actually mediate and act as a peace broker?
Actually, after the Cold War, when the Soviet Union broke into, the world was expecting somewhat of peace. It did not happen. After that, the world, the West took us into the war on terror. And war on terror finished, then the next important step that the US took along with its allies is rising tension in Indo-Pacific. They went into various AUKUS, Quad, and all these things came up after that. And there was one thing common in this, that is countering China. So it is US-China competition that is their priority. So when they're competing with somebody, they don't want to appreciate good things also. It is just like that. They don't want to appreciate good things.
No matter how much damage is done.
No matter how. So therefore, the US interest is different vis-a-vis China, and Russian interest is different vis-a-vis China, and Ukraine interest, in my view, at this time, after 1 year of war or 14 months of war, the Ukrainians have also realized, look, we also have some interest. For instance, the biggest interest today probably in their mind, well, the damage done is food recovery, damage recovery, infrastructure recovery. I don't know if you visited these countries that have been to war for 10 years, Iraq or so, 5 years. It's mind-boggling to see the impact. They will probably take how long to recover out of it. So China has made the impact not only diplomatic, they've also made an impact of getting into BRI and agreements with Iraq, with Iran, 400 billion plus. So that's a big boost that maybe Ukraine, if it is offered through some deal. Otherwise, I don't think historically Americans have ever rebuilt a country. They've only destroyed countries. They have not rebuilt countries. Here is a country which is offering reconstruction. So I think that's the difference. The Americans would not like to appreciate anything. Yes, for sometimes, the UN level and all that, just to say, no, we are also peace loving, so we love peace. But in the hindsight, they have created all the wars that we've seen in the last 30 years. Minus 4 years, minus time of Trump. They've always initiated a war. So China has never initiated a war. So that's the difference. So therefore, to conclude this point, China is going to move because there are incentives for Ukraine. There are incentives for Russia. Because Russia is also spending a lot of money in war. It's a huge amount. I don't know, how can we calculate thousands of missiles and bombs when everything comes in hundreds of millions. So therefore, US would probably not make an acceptance of this proposal or the intentions of the Chinese with open hands, but we'll acknowledge in the diplomatic front.
Right. Ms. LaRouche, when we talk about these 12-point peace proposal, now, as you have already also mentioned in one of your takes that I've just collected from your website, in which you say, talk about the US and NATO allies rejecting this 12-point peace proposal for certain reasons. I would like you to shed a little bit of light regarding that one as well. When we talk about China's position on Ukraine conflict, it has neither condemned Russia's special military operation in Ukraine nor endorsed it. And that is what exactly irritates the Western nations, particularly the US. So what does basically China have to do now after it has set a good example where it can act as a peace mediator, given the fact it has mediated the restoration of diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia at the same time?
Well, I think that China is a country which I think is basically based on a 2,500-year tradition of Confucianism. I think that plays for the sort of the genes of the Chinese philosophy or the Chinese people a much deeper role than even Marxism. That's my view. I don't think that the Chinese would all agree with that, but that's my conclusion. Or they call it Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics, and these characteristics are Confucian, in my view, my observation, and that means that they have an idea of a harmonic development. That you have to have harmony in the family, so that there's harmony in the state, and there has to be harmony among the states, so that there's harmony in the world. And that is actually a world outlook, which is the reason why after 10 years of Belt and Road Initiative, there are now 150 countries who are cooperating with China, and they feel that they have a lot of benefits by doing so. There is also, a complete a renaissance of the non-aligned movement, which I think is a big factor in the world situation. Xi Jinping talks about that we are experiencing changes as they have not been seen since 100 years. I would even say maybe even longer, because the developing countries, the countries of the global south, do not want to continue with the modern form of colonialism, because colonialism formally ended many decades ago, but in reality it continued to exist in the form of IMF conditionalities, of the World Bank policies. But now the BRICS countries are there, and in the recent period 19 countries have made requests to join the BRICS, 12 of them or 13 of them formally and 6 of them informally. But the BRICS already have without that more GDP than the G7. Now, if you add these 19 countries, they will be the largest economic bloc. The growth rates around these countries of China are 5% for this year. If you look at the West, it's basically zero with a galloping inflation. So, it is very clearly that the momentum is going in the direction of the new paradigm. The BRICS countries have just reinvigorated the new development bank. Mrs. Dilma Rousseff is the new director of the new development bank, and President Lula has just said that the new development bank has the great potential to become the great bank of the global south. Now, that is a dynamic which, I think that any country, including Ukraine, which sees that and says, look, maybe it is more advantageous if we, find a way of getting to peace, be part of this development, and go towards a harmonic resolution of this conflict. And I think, I keep saying that the West should stop trying to contain China, which it will not be possible peacefully in any case, because how can you contain a country which has 1.4 billion people and which has an economic policy which is extremely successful for 40 years? China did not experience the kind of cycles which exist.
Ms. LaRouche, you mean to say that the West should take the Chinese proposal for peace seriously rather than going for containing it? A population of 1.4 billion people.
Yes,
Ms.
exactly.
HELGA ZEPP LAROUCHE, founder, chairwoman, SHILLER Institute, joining us on Skype from Wiesbaden, Germany. Thank you very much for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. In the studio, we were joined by Air Marshal retired Mr. FARHAT HUSSAIN Khan, President, Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Thank you very much for your time also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. It was enlightening discussion indeed. And with that, we come to the end of today's show. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.